What does smartest even mean in British politics? Quickest in debate, calmest under pressure, or simply the one who collected the most impressive certificates before turning 30? And what if the country that loves a good exam has been quietly using education as a sorting hat for 3 centuries, sometimes as a doorway, sometimes as a disguise? Tonight we're going to walk through every British Prime Minister's education, but in a very particular way, as a slow, ranked journey from the least formally schooled to the most academically credentialed. Along the way, we'll meet self-taught strivers, aristocrats with a curriculum made of tutors and confidence, and the modern professionals shaped by law, economics, and the strange polished tunnel known as PPE. If you enjoy this kind of long, fact-dense history told softly, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment with the Prime Minister you think was actually the sharpest. Now, lower the lights, settle in, and let's start at the bottom of the ladder. The ground rules for smartest, and why this ranking is deliberately narrow. Before we begin, we have to be honest about the trick in the question. Smartest is not a single measurable thing. Some minds are fast and theatrical, others are slow, stubborn, and frighteningly effective. Some people test brilliantly, others don't test at all, but build systems that outlive them. And British political history is full of prime ministers whose decisions were catastrophic despite glittering credentials, and others who arrived with almost none, yet navigated power with uncanny instinct. So this ranking uses a deliberately narrow proxy: formal education and documented training. Not best person, not wisest leader, not most moral, and definitely not most likable in a podcast interview. We're looking at who had access to structured learning, who completed degrees, who went further into postgraduate study, elite academic fellowships, professional legal training, or rare doctoral work. And because Britain is Britain, we'll also pay attention to the unofficial syllabus, the big schools, the old universities, and the quiet assumption, repeated for centuries, that leadership is something you can teach into a particular accent. With that, we begin where the paperwork is thinnest and the ladder is steepest. Number 58, William Cavendish, Duke of Devonshire, when the record goes quiet. If this list were a library, the Duke of Devonshire would be one of those shelves where the labels have peeled off and no one has bothered to replace them. In formal education terms, his entry feels like an absence, the kind of silence you only get when a person's schooling was assumed, rather than documented in the tidy way later centuries love. In the 18th century aristocratic world, that often meant private tutors, household instruction, languages, riding, and the social choreography of power, education as a posture more than a diploma. And that matters, because a lack of recorded schooling here doesn't necessarily mean a lack of learning. It means something more revealing, a society confident enough in class that it didn't need to keep receipts. The Duke's mind, whatever its strengths, was shaped in rooms where influence was a native language. When you're born into that, the curriculum is proximity, who you dine with, who owes you, who fears you. So at the very bottom of our ranking, we start with a Prime Minister whose education is most visible as privilege, broad, informal, and difficult to pin down. And speaking of education that looks more like social wiring than academic proof, the next figure gives us a clearer example. Number 57, Charles Watson Wentworth, Marquess of Rockingham. A school, a title, and a great deal of assumption. Rockingham's education, as recorded, stops before the modern idea of higher learning properly begin. He was educated at Westminster School, already a powerful conveyor belt into the governing class. Westminster wasn't simply about books. It was about producing a certain kind of English public man, fluent in classics, trained in confidence, and socially threaded into the institutions that mattered. But then the trail goes quiet. No university listed. That gap is important. It places Rockingham among the prime ministers whose authority was not built on formal qualifications, but on landed status, patronage networks, and the political expectation that the ruling class would govern because it was the ruling class. If you want the uncomfortable truth, it's this. For many early prime ministers, education wasn't something you achieved. It was something that happened around you, like servants, estates, and the knowledge that doors would open. Rockingham's rank here isn't an insult to his intelligence. It's simply a reflection of a Britain where leadership often required less proof of learning than proof of birth. And speaking of men who didn't take the university route, but made education into a kind of personal performance, our next entry is one of the most famous. Number 56. Benjamin Disraeli, a prime minister, built out of self-invention. Disraeli's education is fascinating because it sits right on the edge between old Britain and modern Britain. He did not follow the classic path of school to Oxford or Cambridge. Instead, his early schooling is recorded through private education, Dr. Cogan's school in Walthamstow, and then crucially legal training at Lincoln's Inn. That's not a university degree, but it is a form of structured intellectual discipline. The law as an engine for argument, rhetoric, and the understanding of how a state functions on paper. But the deeper story is that Disraeli's education was also literary and theatrical. He educated himself into a persona, one that could enter Parliament and eventually dominate it. In a society obsessed with pedigree, he compensated with style, with language, with audacity. He learned the country the way a novelist learns a character, by observing its hypocrisies, then speaking to them. In this ranking, Disraeli sits low because the formal qualifications are thin, yet he also demonstrates something Britain repeatedly rewards, the ability to sound like you belong, even when you don't. Meanwhile, one of the most transformative prime ministers in modern British history arrives with even fewer formal stamps, yet a fierce, practical intelligence. Number 55. David Lloyd George, the solicitor from the National School. Lloyd George's education begins in a place that feels almost deliberately humble, against the grand halls that dominate this list. A national school in Llanystumdwy. No Oxford, no Cambridge, no smooth procession through colleges that have trained the British governing class for centuries. Instead, Lloyd George trained as a solicitor, learning. Law not as an academic ornament, but as a tool. This kind of education is not about debating societies and polishing an accent. It is about procedure, paperwork, and the hard mechanics of real lives. Property, disputes, the rules people collide with. That difference shows in the way he moved through politics. There's a practical sharpness to the solicitor's mind, the habit of finding leverage inside systems, of reading the fine print, of understanding how power operates not only through speeches but through form. In our narrow, credential-based ranking, Lloyd George sits near the bottom. But if you listen carefully, you can hear why the question smartest is dangerous. Some minds are shaped in lecture hall, others are sharpened on the edge of reality. And speaking of reality as a teacher, our next entry comes from a Britain where university was not the default for political leadership at all. Number 54. James Callaghan, Education by Working Life and the State. James Callaghan represents a whole strand of British political history that feels almost extinct now. The Prime Minister shaped more by work than by campus. His schooling is recorded as Northern Secondary School in Portsmouth. After that, rather than university, he entered the civil service, specifically the Inland Revenue. That sounds dry, and it is, but it's also revealing. The Inland Revenue is where you learn the state as a machine. Taxation, rules, enforcement, the quiet details that keep a country functioning whether anyone is inspired or not. This is a kind of education that rarely gets romanticized. There are no gowns, no Latin mottos, no portraits in oil paint, but it produces a particular understanding that government is at heart administration. Its forms, deadlines, and consequences. It's a structure that must work even when politics is messy. Callaghan's rank here is low because the formal ladder, university degrees, academic honours, simply isn't there. Yet his pathway reminds us that competence can come from doing, not only from studying. And if you think that's unusual, the next man proves how long Britain continued to accept sometimes even celebrate, a Prime Minister without university education. Number 53. John Major, a correspondence course in a country of dreaming spires. John Major's educational profile is almost painfully modest compared to the polished academic histories around him. He attended Rutledge School, and after that there is no university listed. Instead, his further training is described as a correspondence course in banking. It's an education conducted through distance, discipline, and the grind of self-improvement. Paper arriving, work completed, qualifications earned in small practical increments. There's something quietly poignant about that in the context of British leadership. For much of the 20th century, the top of politics was still crowded with people who had passed through ancient institutions designed to replicate a certain kind of elite confidence. Major arrives looking, on paper, like a visitor from a different Britain, one where learning is squeezed between jobs, where ambition is quieter, where a person is not automatically trained to believe they're destined to lead. In our ranking, he remains near the bottom because the formal academic ladder is short, but his presence as Prime Minister is a reminder that Britain occasionally let the system breathe, then slowly tightened it again. Meanwhile, one of the most famous leaders in British history appears next, and he brings a different kind of training entirely. Number 52. Winston Churchill, the military academy instead of the university. Churchill is a perfect example of why education and intellect do not always line up neatly. His schooling includes Harrow, one of the great public schools, but after that, there is no university degree recorded. Instead, his formal training route runs through the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. That is not academic in the traditional sense. It is disciplined, hierarchical, practical, designed to produce officers rather than scholars. Sandhurst education trains you to operate under pressure, to make decisions with incomplete information, to lead people who may be frightened and exhausted. It teaches command presence, not thesis writing. And Churchill, for all his later literary output and historical writing, begins his adult learning inside an institution built for military authority. In this ranking, Churchill sits low because we are measuring formal academic credentials. Yet his example is important. Britain has often been comfortable with leaders whose education is more about command and confidence than about formal scholarship. And speaking of command, our next entry is a man whose entire public image became inseparable from military discipline. Number 51. Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, educated for horses, war and order. Wellington's education reads like a portrait of an older Britain, aristocratic schooling and specialised training rather than university study. He attended Eton, already one of the most socially powerful launching pads in the country, but there is no university recorded. Instead, his formal training includes a French Royal Academy of Equitation in Angers, an education tied to horsemanship, discipline, and the physical culture of an officer class. This matters because it shows how leadership used to be conceptualized. A prime minister, especially one who rose through military life, did not need a degree in philosophy or economics. He needed the poise of command and the social legitimacy of the ruling class. His schooling prepared him not for policy seminars, but for a world where authority was embodied, where the leader's presence, reputation and control mattered as much as the detail. In our narrow measurement, Wellington remains in the lower tier. The academic paperwork isn't there, but his pathway reveals something deeper. Britain's long willingness to treat military formation as an equivalent, or even superior, education for governance. And now, with the no university group established, we step into a grey zone. Prime ministers who brushed against higher education, but in ways that didn't always end with a clean, framed degree. The first checkpoint, Britain's no university, prime ministers and what they tell us. Pause for a moment and look at what we've already seen. A cluster of prime ministers reached the top without a university degree, some through work, some through law, some through the military, and some through the sheer inheritance of status. This isn't just trivia. It's a window into how Britain has repeatedly defined fitness to govern. In the 18th century, elite education could be informal because class carried the authority. In the early 20th century, rising figures could come through professional training, like law, without university, because the professions themselves were becoming alternative universities. And in the 20th century, a handful of leaders arrived via work and state bureaucracy, carrying a different kind of intelligence, procedural, practical, grounded. But here's the twist. As we move upward through this ranking, Britain becomes more credentialed, more formal, more obsessed with institutions that can be named and ranked. The ladder narrows, the accents get smoother, the degrees start stacking. Now we move into that middle category, people who didn't complete the classic path but did reach towards structured study. Number 50, Ramsay MacDonald, extramural learning and the hunger to catch up. Ramsay MacDonald's education is recorded in a way that feels both modest and intensely telling. Drainey Parish School, followed by extramural study at Birkbeck Literary and Scientific Institution. Birkbeck carries a particular meaning in British educational history. It represents education for people who are not supposed to have leisure. Learning fitted around work, study done at night, knowledge pursued because it has to be pursued. MacDonald's pathway signals hunger, the kind of intellectual ambition that isn't cushioned by inherited certainty. In formal terms, extramural study is not the same as a conventional university degree. It doesn't carry the same social currency that Oxford and Cambridge stamped onto their alumni, but it does carry something else. Discipline without applause, a willingness to sit with difficult material because you want to become the kind of person who can. In our ranking, MacDonald rises above the no university group because he actively pursued structured learning beyond school. But he also highlights a theme we'll keep seeing. British politics has always had two educations running in parallel, the official one and the one people build for themselves when the official one is not designed for them. And speaking of learning that happens on the edges rather than in the centre, our next figure brushed a university world without the neat completion of a conventional degree. Number 49, Bonar Law, Glasgow, but not the full ornaments. Bonar Law's education is recorded as the High School of Glasgow, followed by the University of Glasgow as an extramural student. Again, the key word here is extramural. Outside the full, formal resident student structure that often leads to a degree and the social networks attached to it. This places Bonar Law in that interesting middle tier. He is not university educated in the glossy Oxbridge way, but he is also not purely self-taught. He moved towards structured knowledge, engaged with a university environment, but without the full ceremonial conclusion. What does that mean for smartest? It means we're looking at someone shaped by education as an instrument rather than an identity. He didn't collect academic prestige as a badge. He reached for learning where he could. In the wider pattern, Bonar Law is one of the reminders that Scotland's educational culture, more broadly accessible in many periods, fed British leadership in a different way than England's elite public school pipeline. He climbs a little higher on our ladder because the university appears on his record. But the ladder is still steep, and ahead of him are prime ministers whose education becomes more technical, more specialised, and more recognisably modern. Number 48, Neville Chamberlain, technical study before politics swallows you. Neville Chamberlain's education includes rugby school, followed by study at Mason College in metallurgy. Mason College, one of the institutional routes that later became part of the University of Birmingham, signals something different from the classical Oxbridge formation. Metallurgy is applied, industrial, technical. It is the language of modern Britain's factories and engineering ambitions rather than the ancient language of Latin and Greek. This is important because it points to a Britain trying to educate leaders for the industrial world. Chamberlain's pathway suggests a mind trained to think in materials, systems, production, and practical outcomes. That doesn't automatically make someone wise in diplomacy. History is painfully clear about that. But it does mark a distinct educational profile compared with the purely aristocratic or purely rhetorical pathways. In our ranking, he rises above the extramural students because his studies were technical and directed, part of a professional preparation. Yet the record doesn't read like a completed university degree with the full suite of academic honours. It reads like training for industry, education aimed at usefulness. And now we approach one of the great British phenomena, the brilliant man who attended the most famous university in the country, then left without finishing. Number 47. Harold Macmillan. Oxford, Interrupted, and the Education of Events. Harold Macmillan's education looks at first glance like classic elite Britain, Eton, then Oxford, Balliol College, studying classics. And then the neat story breaks. The record shows he did not graduate. That detail matters because it introduces a theme we'll meet again and again as we climb. In earlier eras, attending Oxford or Cambridge could be socially sufficient even without completing a degree. The university functioned as a finishing machine, a networking engine, a place to absorb the manner and language of the governing class. Completion was ideal, but sometimes not required, especially if life, war, or family expectations pulled you elsewhere. Macmillan's interrupted Oxford education becomes, in a sense, replaced by the education of events. The early 20th century did that to many people. Formal study was often shattered by history, and the state learned to accept leaders who were shaped more by experience than by exams. In our ranking, Macmillan sits above the technical and extramural cases because Oxford still carries weight, and his course of study was rigorous even without the diploma. But he remains below those who completed degrees because the paper trail stops short. And speaking of famous names who entered universities as a matter of course, only to treat graduation as optional, our next entry shows the same aristocratic shrug. Number 46. Charles Grey, Earl Grey, Cambridge without the finish line. Eton, then Cambridge, Trinity College, and then, intriguingly, no graduation. Earl Grey's record embodies the older British idea that elite education was partly about attendance. Trinity College, Cambridge was and remains one of the grand training grounds of the British establishment. Simply being there placed you in an ecosystem of power, networks, relationships, and cultural confidence. But his lack of a completed degree tells us something about the era's relationship with credentials. Grey's political authority didn't depend on academic certification. He was of a class where governance was considered a responsibility attached to status. The university was less a gate you had to pass through and more a place you were expected to spend time, like a season in London. In a modern ranking, that feels strange, almost reckless, but in Grey's Britain, the real test wasn't an exam paper. It was whether you could command respect in a room full of people like you, and whether enough of them would follow. He ranks low because our measurement is formal completion, yet his profile is a perfect example of how the British system long treated elite education as an accessory rather than a proof. And now, as we keep climbing, we meet another Prime Minister whose Oxford education remained unfinished, though the institution itself still stamped him with prestige. Number 45. Archibald Primrose, Earl of Rosebery, Christ Church, Oxford, left unwrapped. Rosebery's education begins in the most classic way imaginable. Eton, then Christ Church, Oxford. If you wanted to design a British Prime Minister in a laboratory of inherited advantage, you would start there. Eton builds the accent, the confidence, the sense of belonging. Christ Church adds the historical gravity, the social network, the sensation that Britain's institutions are not simply places but family heirlooms. And then, he does not graduate. Again, the missing degree doesn't mean the education wasn't real. It means the era didn't punish incompletion in the same way, particularly for men of Rosebery's standing. The university experience was still valuable. It polished, it connected, it affirmed. The paper at the end was sometimes secondary. In our ranking, Rosebery sits above some of the other non-graduates because his educational institutions were at the very centre of British elite formation. Yet he remains below those who completed degrees because the narrow metric we're using is relentless. A country can be built on tradition, but a ranking is built on receipts. Next, we continue through this attended but did not complete corridor, because Britain produced more prime ministers here than it probably wants to admit out loud. Number 44, Robert Walpole. Cambridge, no graduation and the birth of the job. Robert Walpole sits at a strange junction in British educational history, because he's both early and oddly credentialed in a way that doesn't quite count. Official records indicate he attended Eton, then went on to Cambridge, King's College, between 1696 and 1698, and then, in the neat, modern sense, the story stops. He did not graduate. But Walpole's name later acquires an academic afterglow. Cambridge awarded him an LL.D. in 1728, an honour that reads less like a youthful course completed and more like a university saluting a man who had become powerful enough to be worth flattering. That's why he lands here, above some of the other non-graduates we've met. He didn't leave with a normal degree, but he did end up with the kind of formal Latin letters that looked impressive on paper. It's a reminder that in early Britain, education and authority often chased each other in a circle. The university polished the statesman, and the statesman reflected prestige back onto the university. And speaking of men who attended university but didn't quite finish, Walpole's immediate successor offers a very similar pattern, with an extra twist of legal training. Number 43, Spencer Compton, Earl of Wilmington. Oxford without the diploma, law without the glory. Spencer Compton, the Earl of Wilmington, has one of those educational records that sounds elite until you listen carefully. He was educated at St. Paul's School, serious, rigorous, London-rooted, and then matriculated at Trinity College, Oxford. Yet official listings describe him as not graduating. The Oxford years appear like a doorway opened and then walked away from, leaving only the impression of having been inside. What lifts him slightly above Walpole in this ranking is the professional track layered onto that incomplete university story. He was associated with Middle Temple, one of the Inns of Court. That matters because legal training is a kind of structured intellect, argument, precedent, the ability to navigate rules and pressure without panicking. And then, like Walpole, he later received a formal-sounding academic honour. Oxford awarded him a DCL in 1730. Again, it carries the faint smell of retrospective respect, the institution granting a credential after the political world has already decided the man is significant. Wilmington's education, in other words, is a blend of elite proximity and professional discipline, still below the modern degree holders but clearly climbing. Meanwhile, the next Prime Minister shows a pattern that will become very familiar. The politician who samples both Cambridge and Oxford, yet leaves without the neat, final stamp. Number 42, Henry Pelham. 2 universities, 0 graduation, and a lot of confidence. Henry Pelham's education looks expansive, until you notice how it ends. He went to Westminster School, one of the great classical factories of Britain's ruling class. Then he attended Cambridge, King's College, briefly around 1709 to 1710. After that, he appears at Oxford, at Hart Hall, with the record showing he did not graduate. In a modern context, this looks like indecision or interruption. In Pelham's world, it could be something else entirely. Education as a finishing process rather than a qualification chase. The point wasn't necessarily to rack up degrees. The point was to spend time inside the institutions that trained the elite to sound like the elite. That's why Pelham sits here, above the single institution non-graduates. He was exposed to both of the great English universities. Even if he did not complete a formal course, he absorbed their culture, their networks, their assumptions, then carried that forward into government. But he remains below the graduates because for all the polished schooling, the paper trail never lands on a completed degree. And speaking of Cambridge attendance without completion, Pelham's close political world leads us to a man who received a very particular kind of academic upgrade later on. Number 41, Thomas Pelham Holles, Duke of Newcastle. Cambridge no degree, then a doctorate for being important. The Duke of Newcastle is one of those prime ministers whose education reveals the old mechanics of prestige. He was educated at Westminster School, then attended Cambridge, Clare College. The record indicates he did not graduate, in a ladder built strictly on degrees that should keep him low. But Newcastle's file includes a later flourish. Cambridge awarded him an LL.D. in 1728. Just like Walpole's honorary letters, this kind of degree reads as institutional recognition of power rather than proof of academic achievement. The university, in effect, confers status in formal Latin after the man has already acquired status in Parliament. That is why he ranks slightly above Pelham, not because he necessarily studied more, but because his educational record displays the full aristocratic cycle: attend the right places, leave without a conventional degree, return years later as a figure so influential the university ceremonially drapes a doctorate over your shoulders. It's a quiet lesson in how Britain often treats smartness as social gravity. The credential follows the influence. And speaking of influence, our next entry shows another familiar blend: Oxford attendance without graduation plus legal training as a practical substitute for university completion. Number 40. George Grenville, Christ Church. Oxford no degree, then straight into the law. George Grenville's education is classic establishment Britain, but with a missing last page. He went to Eton, then to Christ Church, Oxford, one of the most politically potent colleges of them all. Yet the record indicates he did not graduate. So once again, we're in that old world where going to Oxford could be socially meaningful, even if you didn't leave with a certificate. What makes Grenville stand out, what nudges him higher than some of the other non-graduates, is that he paired Oxford with a professional training route. He was connected to the Inner Temple, one of the Inns of Court. That's not merely an ornament. It's a system that teaches structured reasoning, argument, and the habit of thinking in rule. If you're trying to understand British governance, the Inns of Court are almost their own universities, sometimes more directly relevant to actual government than the dreamy lecture halls. Grenville remains below true graduates because the Oxford story never resolves into a degree, but he sits above the purely attended cases because the legal training suggests discipline rather than drift. And speaking of Oxford, attended but not finished, next comes a man whose education includes not just Oxford, but an extra European chapter, as if he tried to complete his learning elsewhere. Number 39. William Pitt the Elder, Earl of Chatham. Oxford left behind, then a year abroad. William Pitt the Elder, the Earl of Chatham, has an educational record that feels restless. He attended Eton, then went to Trinity College, Oxford. Official records describe him as not graduating. But unlike some earlier figures, Pitt's learning did not simply stop when Oxford stopped. Contemporary accounts and later biographies note that he spent time at Utrecht University in 1728, a brief continental chapter that suggests a search for additional training, often described as leaning toward law and political understanding. In ranking terms, that extra step matters. It indicates intellectual momentum rather than simple aristocratic drifting. Even if he didn't take a degree, he moved through a wider educational landscape than many of the men below him. Oxford gave him polish and connections. The European experience exposed him to another intellectual climate, another way of thinking about states, systems, and the wider world. Pitt sits below the graduates because our metric is brutally literal about completion. But he rises above many non-graduates because his education looks like deliberate expansion, learning as something pursued, not merely inherited. Meanwhile, one more Prime Minister remains in this Oxford no-degree corridor, though his early schooling record is hazier, which is itself a clue about the era. Number 38. William Petty, Earl of Shelburne, Christ Church. Oxford no finish line, Shelburne's educational record has a slightly ghostly quality. Official listings show him at Christ Church, Oxford between 1755 and 1757, and note that he did not graduate. His school education is less cleanly presented in the standard summaries, another reminder that in some aristocratic lives, early learning could be stitched together through private tutors and household arrangements rather than a single famous school with a famous register. What matters for our ranking is the Oxford detail. Shelburne sat inside the centre of elite academic Britain, then left without the formal concluding degree. That places him firmly among the attended but not certified prime ministers, the men for whom education was a marker of class membership more than a tested achievement. He is higher than those with no university at all, because Oxford still represents access to structured learning and to the networks of power. But he is lower than the graduates because the story ends in the middle. And now, finally, we reach a turning point. After all these half-finished academic journeys, someone actually walks out with a degree in hand. Number 37, Augustus Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton. The first clean graduation on our ladder. With the Duke of Grafton, the educational record suddenly looks satisfyingly complete. He was educated at Westminster School, then attended Cambridge, Peterhouse, and is recorded as completing an MA in 1753. In the 18th century university system, that MA sits on top of a BA foundation, and even where the process involved time and custom, it still signals something the earlier men lacked, a formally completed course of study. In our narrow ranking, that completion matters enormously. For the first time in this countdown, we have a Prime Minister whose university story ends with an actual credential earned through the established academic pathway. It does not necessarily mean he was smarter than the men below him. It means the system around him had begun to value a visible finish line, or at least had begun recording it with more care. Grafton's degree is not paired with a long list of professional training or later academic distinctions, which is why he sits at the lower edge of our graduate tier. But he marks the shift, Britain moving slowly from he attended toward he completed. And speaking of completion at the highest status college of its kind, next comes a graduate whose education embodies Oxford's most politically famous address. Number 36, William Cavendish Bentinck, Duke of Portland, Christ Church, Oxford, degree finished, power assumed. Portland's education looks like the fully assembled establishment kit. He attended Westminster School, then Christ Church, Oxford, an institution that seems to hover over British governance like a permanent chandelier. Unlike many of the earlier Christ Church attendees we've met, Portland is recorded as completing an MA in 1757. That completion nudges him higher than Grafton. It isn't about the subject matter here so much as the facts of graduation and the prestige of the setting. Christ Church wasn't only academic, it was social architecture. To study there and leave with a degree was to carry a credential that functioned as both intellectual certification and social passport. Still, Portland's record, at least in the simplest educational summaries, doesn't include the extra layers we'll see higher up. Inns of court training, fellowships, specialist postgraduate work, or unusual subjects. He's a graduate, yes, but still a graduate of the older style. Classics of governance taught as much by environment as by curriculum. He sits above Grafton because the pathway looks more conventionally elite, but he sits below those who added professional discipline or broader study. And speaking of broader study, our next entry takes the Oxford degree and then adds an extra European year, like someone trying to widen the mind beyond the English gate. Number 35, Frederick North, Lord North, Oxford graduate, then Leipzig, then back to power. Lord North's education is where the ladder starts to look unmistakably smart, even by modern standards. He attended Eton, then Trinity College, Oxford, and is recorded as completing an MA in 1750. That alone puts him firmly above the non-graduates and the simplest degree holders. But North's record then adds something rarer, time at Leipzig University, around 1751 to 1752. That continental study signals intellectual breadth. It suggests exposure to different academic traditions, different political and legal ideas, and a Europe that was thinking about statecraft in ways that didn't always match the English habit. In a country often accused of educating its leaders inside a single narrow cultural corridor, North's Leipzig chapter stands out. It doesn't make him wiser, but it does make him more academically expansive than the degree-only cases just below. That's why he ranks higher than Portland and Grafton in this educational metric. He completes the elite university track, then adds an international layer, and now, as we move upward, professional training begins to pile on top of university degrees, law in particular turning prime ministers into men trained to argue with the state's own machinery. Number 34, William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne, Cambridge degree, Scottish intellect, and the law as a second university. Viscount Melbourne's educational record has a richness that feels almost modern in its variety. He attended Eton, then Trinity College, Cambridge, and is recorded as completing an MA in 1799. That's already a clear graduate profile. But his learning doesn't stop there. He is also recorded as a resident pupil at the University of Glasgow, studying under a professor associated with the Scottish Enlightenment tradition. This matters because Scottish university culture often emphasised moral philosophy, law, and political economy in a way that fed directly into the intellectual climate of modern governance. And then comes the professional stamp, Lincoln's Inn. Legal training adds another layer of formal discipline, argument, precedent, procedure. It's one thing to have absorbed the atmosphere of Cambridge. It's another to have your mind trained in the law's tight corridors, where words and definitions can decide outcomes. Melbourne ranks higher than Lord North because his education is not only completed and broadened, but also professionally sharpened. He's a reminder that smartness in politics often looks like layered formation. University for culture and networks, then law for structure and combat readiness. And speaking of law as a political weapon, our next entry has the classic combination, a top university degree, then Lincoln's Inn, then the kind of public career that ends abruptly in tragedy. Number 33, Spencer Perceval, Cambridge, a degree, then Lincoln's Inn. Spencer Perceval's education follows the increasingly familiar 19th century path of the governing class, only in his case it looks almost textbook perfect. He attended Harrow, then Trinity College, Cambridge, and is recorded as completing an MA in 1782. This places him well above the attended, but not graduated figures, because it signals formal completion within the most prestigious university ecosystem in the country. Then comes the second pillar, Lincoln's Inn. Legal training was, for many prime ministers, the practical academy of power. It taught how to build an argument that survives scrutiny, how to interpret rules, how to exploit ambiguity without sounding like you're exploiting it. Perceval ranks higher than Melbourne in one respect. His education looks intensely focused on the classic British leadership pathway. Elite school, elite university, elite legal training. Yet he lacks Melbourne's broader intellectual seasoning through a second university environment like Glasgow. So he sits here, highly credentialed, professionally trained, but not quite as wide in academic exposure as some of those above him will be. And now we move into a dense thicket of Oxford and Cambridge graduates, where the differences become subtler. Subjects, fellowships, special honours, and the early hints of the modern, professional political class. Number 32, Robert Jenkinson, Earl of Liverpool, Christ Church. Oxford and the degree as a default, Lord Liverpool's education is where the paperwork becomes reassuringly tidy. He was educated at Charterhouse School, then went to Christ Church, Oxford, and completed an MA in 1790. There's no extra professional layer here in the usual summaries, no Inn of Court listed as the next formal stamp, no second university, no fellowship that suggests an academic career briefly tempted him. That simplicity is exactly why he sits here, at the lower edge of our graduates tier. Compared with the attended but not finished figures below, Liverpool has a completed university record, but compared with the prime ministers above who stack law, training, specialist subjects or extra institutions, his profile is closer to a baseline, the classic route of a well-born political life where a degree is less a trophy and more a rite of passage. If you imagine this ranking as a staircase, Liverpool is the moment you step out of the fog of incomplete education and onto solid stone, not necessarily smarter than those below, but undeniably more formally credentialed. And speaking of similarly clean Oxbridge completion, next comes a man with an equally finished degree but from the other ancient university. Number 31, Frederick John Robinson, Viscount Godric, Cambridge completion without the extra layers. Viscount Godric sits one step higher than Liverpool for a small but telling reason. His education reflects a clean Cambridge finish in an era when that completion was increasingly a badge of polish and competence. He attended Harrow School and then St John's College, Cambridge, completing an MA in 1802. Like Liverpool, the record doesn't usually add professional training on top. No Inns of Court are highlighted as the next stage. No second institution that widens the academic lens. So why does he rank higher? Because at this point in the ladder, we're separating very similar profiles by nuances, where the education was rooted, how solidly documented the completion is, and how much the degree looks like the central formation of the person rather than a formality. Goderic's Cambridge pathway reads as an entire early identity: school, university, degree, and then straight into the machinery of government. He's still not in the stacked credentials group. He's the quiet middle, educated, finished, but not academically ornate. And speaking of ornate, our next entry adds that little extra flourish: the clearly recorded undergraduate degree and the sense of a mind trained to perform. Number 30, George Canning, Christ Church, Oxford, a clear BA and the rise of the polished intellect. George Canning's education looks like the same establishment corridor as Liverpool, Eton, Christ Church, Oxford, but the details are slightly sharper. He completed a BA in 1791 and later an MA in 1794. That explicit undergraduate degree matters in this ranking because it signals a more clearly documented academic finish, less of the old haze where attendance alone could be socially sufficient. Canning's intellectual reputation was closely tied to expression, the idea of the brilliant speaker, the political writer, the man who could turn policy into language and language into power. A classical education at Christ Church didn't just teach text, it trained the mind to argue in public, to shape narrative, to hit an opponent with an elegant sentence and make it look effortless. Compared with Goderic, Canning's record feels slightly more academic in the formal sense, more visibly completed, more explicitly credentialed. Compared with the heavyweights above, though, he still lacks the extra professional stamp. No Inn of Court listed, no second institution, no specialist track beyond the standard elite formation. He rises because he looks, on paper, like the modern prototype of the educated politician. And speaking of prototypes, next comes a Prime Minister whose education is tidy and complete, but whose presence in this ranking reminds you that degrees don't always change the temperament of power. Number 29, Alec Douglas Home, Christ Church, Oxford and modern history as training for government. Alec Douglas Home's education is a later example of the classic Oxford route, less 18th century ornament, more 20th century clarity. He attended Eton, then Christ Church, Oxford, studying modern history and completing a BA in 1925. That subject is worth pausing on because modern history was, for many future politicians, a direct rehearsal for public life. Systems, institutions, how states behave when pushed, how leaders make decisions and then justify them. Compared with Canning, Douglas Home's record is more straightforward. No explicit second degree listed, no professional legal training attached in the usual educational summaries, but his academic pathway is clean: a named subject, a completed degree, and a college with deep political associations. He ranks slightly higher because modern history, as a stated course, reads like deliberate preparation for governance, rather than the broader, sometimes vague, classical gentleman formation of earlier figures. It's still not stacked in the way the highest entries will be, but it is recognizably modern, study completed, subject named, and the implicit promise that learning can be applied. And speaking of modern, Our next entries climb into the era where PPE becomes an almost suspiciously common stamp. Number 28, David Cameron. Oxford PPE and the factory-set politician David Cameron's education is the kind that in late 20th century Britain almost feels like an industry standard. He attended Eton, then Brasenose College, Oxford, and completed a BA in PPE, Philosophy, Politics and Economics, in 1988, later receiving the customary MA status. PPE matters in this ranking because it is explicitly designed as a politician's toolkit, a little theory, a little systems thinking, a little economics, and a great deal of practice in constructing arguments that sound reasonable. It trains you to move between ideas quickly, to speak with confidence about complex trade-offs, and, crucially, to make uncertainty sound like a policy choice. Compared with Douglas Home's modern history, PPE is less narrative and more modular. It breaks the world into components, then teaches you to rearrange them. That structure can look like intelligence from the outside, fast summaries, neat frameworks, but it can also create a particular kind of blindness. Everything becomes a problem to be managed rather than a life to be lived. Cameron ranks above the plain degree holders because PPE signals deliberate political formation. He's still below the legal trainees and postgraduate achievers ahead. But the ladder has entered a new corridor now, one lit by seminars and confidence. And speaking of similar modern degrees, next comes a prime minister whose subject looks quieter on paper, but whose education shows the same Oxford finish line. Number 27. Theresa May, Oxford Geography and the Practical Intelligence of Systems. Theresa May's education follows the modern pattern of clear completion, but with a subject that often gets underestimated. She attended Holton Park Girls' Grammar School and then St Hugh's College, Oxford, completing a BA in Geography in 1977, later receiving the customary MA status. Geography, at its best, is a discipline that forces you to think in systems. It's not only maps, it's people on land, resources under pressure, patterns that repeat across regions, the way economics and environment shape what governments can realistically do. It trains you to hold multiple variables at once and not panic. Compared with Cameron's PPE, May's geography looks less like a political factory product and more like a broader systems education. That subtlety is why she edges above him here. It suggests a mind trained to integrate, not just to argue. She's still not in the top tier because the record doesn't stack additional degrees or professional legal training on top. But in this middle range of the ranking, subject begins to matter as much as institution, because the ladder is now crowded with people who all have Oxford on the page, and we have to separate them somehow. And speaking of crowded, next comes a Prime Minister whose education is almost the stereotype of the British ruling class, distilled. Number 26. Boris Johnson, Oxford Classics and the Performance of Brilliance. Boris Johnson's education is the classic British political story told with maximum theatricality. He attended Eton, then Balliol College, Oxford, studying classics and completing a BA in 1987, later receiving the customary MA status. Classics is one of those subjects that can feel like a secret handshake in British elite culture. It signals that you've wrestled with ancient texts, learned to translate, learned to argue, learned to make the past sound like a mirror for the present. In ranking terms, he sits above May because classics, especially in the traditional Oxbridge mode, tends to be treated as a marker of intellectual sharpness in the old establishment imagination, not necessarily because it is harder than geography, but because it trains a particular kind of rhetorical agility, the ability to quote, to frame, to persuade, to entertain. Compared with earlier classics graduates like Canning, Johnson's education comes from a later era, when degrees are more uniformly recorded and completion is less negotiable, but he still lacks the credential stacking above. No in-of-court training listed in the usual educational summaries, no postgraduate degree, so he rises here on the strength of a demanding, prestige-heavy subject, an education that can look like pure intelligence, especially when it's performed with confidence. And speaking of confidence trained in the same Oxford corridor, next comes another PPE graduate, but with a pathway that feels slightly more direct and less gilded. Number 25, Liz Truss, Oxford PPE. Without the old school public school script, Liz Truss's education is an example of how the modern British political class can emerge with the right academic stamp, even without the most traditional early school pedigree. She attended Roundhay School and then Merton College, Oxford, reading PPE and completing a BA between 1993 and 1996 in terms of the formal metric that places her firmly in the modern graduate tier named subject completed degree Oxford credential. Compared with Cameron's PPE, Truss's record lacks the Eton to Oxford glide path, which in this ranking doesn't count as smarter, but does matter for what the education represents socially. Her pathway suggests entry into elite political formation through academic achievement rather than purely through inherited networks. At least on the page. She ranks above Johnson here because PPE is explicitly designed as political training in a way Classics is not. Classics teaches you to argue. PPE teaches you to argue about government while sounding like you've already been inside it. Still, Truss remains below the heavier credential stacks ahead. She's a single-degree Prime Minister, and we're about to enter the part of the ranking where single degrees start to look like the minimum, not the achievement. If you've made it this far up the ladder, you can feel the air changing. More law, more fellowships, more institutions, more layers, and that begins with a leader whose education is both classical and aggressively practical. The man who treated mathematics as part of politics. Number 24, Robert Peel, Oxford Classics and Mathematics, then the law. Robert Peel's education is where this ranking begins to feel undeniably serious. He attended Harrow, then Christ Church, Oxford, studying both classics and mathematics, completing a BA in 1808 and later receiving the MA status. That combination matters. Classics trains rhetoric and argument. Mathematics trains structure, precision, and the habit of proving rather than merely persuading. Then comes the extra layer that pushes him above the single-degree moderns. Lincoln's Inn. Legal training adds discipline, a professional relationship with rules, and a way of thinking where definitions and precedents actually bite. Compared with Johnson's classics-only pathway, Peel's record looks like a broader mental toolkit. Compared with Truss's PPE, Peel's formation looks less like a political syllabus and more like a full intellectual workout. Ancient language, formal reasoning, then the law. This is the stage of the ladder where smartest begins to mean most trained. Not necessarily most creative, not necessarily most humane, but most systematically sharpened by formal study. And speaking of law layered on top of an Oxbridge degree, next comes a Prime Minister who followed a similarly legal path, but through a degree that looks like a clean, modern undergraduate credential. Number 23, Tony Blair, Oxford Law, then the bar as a second classroom. Tony Blair's education looks on paper like the modern professional pathway into leadership. A clear degree, a clear training route, and then a career built on argument. He went to Fettes College in Edinburgh, then studied law at Oxford, at St John's College, completing his undergraduate degree in the mid-1970s. After that came the true sharpening stone, professional legal training and the life of a barrister. Whatever people think of his politics, the legal pathway teaches a very specific kind of intelligence, how to build a case, how to anticipate objections, how to stay fluent under pressure, and how to sound calm while you're steering a conversation where you want it to go. In this ranking, Blair sits at the bottom of our remaining top tier, not because his education is weak, but because it is single track compared with what comes next. He has a strong degree and a powerful professional formation, but fewer layers of additional academic credentials than the men and women above him. He's the threshold figure, the moment where Prime Minister education becomes recognizably modern. University plus a profession, the mind trained for the courtroom and then carried straight into politics. And speaking of minds trained to move through institutions with confidence, the next Prime Minister's education is elite in setting, but shaped by a world event that disrupted many tidy academic stories. Number 22, Anthony Eden, Oxford interrupted, then educated by war and diplomacy. Anthony Eden's education begins in the classic British Register, Eton, then Christ Church, Oxford. But unlike many of the neat modern degree profiles, Eden's university story is often described as interrupted by the First World War. That matters for our metric because the ranking rewards completed credentials, yet also recognises that some prime ministers were forced into an education of experience. At the moment, formal study was supposed to happen. In Eden's case, the education that followed Oxford wasn't lecture halls, it was the war. Then the diplomatic world, languages, negotiations, and the slow learning that happens when you spend years watching nations lie politely to one another. Eden became associated with foreign affairs early and deeply, and that kind of training produces a mind that can read tone, implication, and danger. So why does he rank above Blair? Because Eden's pathway is broader in one sense. He carried the elite institutional formation of Eton and Oxford, then layered on the brutal, formative schooling of war and diplomacy. It is less credential-heavy than many above, but it is a distinct kind of education, and it shaped his public mind. Still, because his academic completion is less tidy than a full degree list, he stays below the more formally stacked profiles ahead. Meanwhile, we step into a different kind of intellect now. The scholar-politician who didn't always finish degrees but treated reading and study as a lifelong habit. Number 21, Robert Cecil, Marquess of Salisbury, Oxford attendance, then the private university of books. Salisbury's educational record sits in that older, very British space where academic completion and intellectual seriousness don't always match up neatly. He is generally recorded as having attended Eton and then Christ Church, Oxford. Some accounts describe him as leaving Oxford without taking a degree, which places him on paper closer to the attended but did not graduate figures we met earlier in the countdown. Yet Salisbury is also remembered by contemporaries as much as by later historians as intensely learned in a private, self-directed way, the kind of man who treats his own library as a university. That's part of why he rises above Eden in our narrow ranking. The Oxford layer is present, even if the final certificate is uncertain or absent in some record. And beyond that, Salisbury's political mind was shaped by sustained reading, careful analysis, and the cold habit of thinking in systems, particularly the systems of diplomacy and empire. In other words, even where the academic record is imperfect, the education is visible as method. A man trained by constant study rather than by a parade of degrees. He remains below the truly credential-stacked prime ministers because our metric demands formal proof where possible. But he stands above those whose education is narrower because his intellectual formation was deeper than the paperwork suggests. And speaking of aristocratic education that looks informal on the page but surprisingly broad in reality, we arrive at a Prime Minister whose schooling often included a continental chapter. Number 20, John Stuart, Earl of Bute, the aristocrat with a continental gloss. Lord Bute's education is one of those profiles that can feel both refined and strangely hard to measure. As an aristocrat, he was shaped by private tutoring and the expectations of a class that treated learning as part of a gentleman's polish. He is often associated with study beyond the standard English school corridor, including time on the continent, a pattern common for high-born young men who treated Europe as a finishing school in itself. Bute was also known in his own time for serious interests that went beyond politics, particularly in the world of books, collecting, and learned pursuits. That matters because in our ranking we're measuring education as formal training and documented formation. When the documentation is less degree-like, the best we can do is to describe the shape of the learning, broad, cultivated, and intentionally expanded. He ranks above Salisbury because his education is generally described as more deliberately international in flavour, more of that continental seasoning that earlier figures like Lord North displayed. Yet he remains below the modern degree and profession prime ministers above, because the record doesn't always present a neat, completed university credential that can be cleanly compared. His place here is a reminder that Britain once produced leaders whose education was essentially designed as a lifestyle. Languages, travel, reading, and the confidence that comes from being taught the world belongs to you. And now, as we climb, we meet a different kind of formative mind, one shaped by elite schooling, but also by a broader engagement with learning outside the narrowest English track. Number 19. John Russell, Earl Russell. Study across institutions, education as a wide net lord. John Russell's education often reads like a web rather than a straight line. He is associated with Westminster School, and he is frequently described as having pursued study in broader academic environments, particularly in Scotland, where university culture could be more open and intellectually wide-ranging than the English elite tradition. In Russell's case, the point is less a single glittering credential and more the pattern. Exposure to multiple centres of learning, then a lifetime of political engagement that demanded constant reading and argument. In ranking terms, Russell climbs above Bute because his education is less purely finishing school aristocracy and more recognisably academic in tone, even where the record doesn't always present a neat completed degree in the modern style. The shape of his formation suggests genuine engagement with ideas, history, political systems, constitutional questions, rather than education as mere social polish. He remains below those who clearly completed degrees and professional training, because our metric rewards formal completion when it's documented. But among the more diffuse educational profiles, Russell stands out as someone whose learning was broader and more intellectually driven than the standard attended then ruled pattern. And speaking of men whose education was both elite and unusually energetic in its outcomes, we arrive at a Prime Minister whose academic and social formation looks like a strong, tidy Victorian template. Number 18. Edward Smith Stanley, Earl of Derby, Eton, Oxbridge, and the full finish. The Earl of Derby represents the Victorian idea of a properly educated statesman, a polished early education, followed by a formal university finish that left no ambiguity about completion. He is generally recorded as having been educated at Eton and then at Oxford, completing his degree in the early 19th century. The details most often emphasised in the broad summaries are less about specialist subject and more about the fact of completion. Derby belongs to the generation where leaving university with a finished credential was becoming the norm for elite political figures. In our ranking, he rises above Russell because the academic story looks cleaner and more institutionally sealed. He is less wide net and more finished pathway. That matters for our metric, but he remains below those who layered law or additional institutions on top, because his profile is still largely a single university completion, impressive in its social currency, but not yet stacked with professional training that reshapes the mind. Derby sits here as a kind of hinge figure, the old aristocratic confidence but increasingly accompanied by the modern expectation that education should be completed and recorded. And speaking of recorded completion, we move into an era where prime ministers begin arriving with not only degrees, but also the habits of the modern administrative and economic world. Number 17, Stanley Baldwin, Cambridge, then the education of industry and management. Stanley Baldwin's education reflects a Britain moving toward modern governance, where leadership begins to look like management as much as aristocratic presence. He attended Harrow and then Trinity College, Cambridge, completing his university education before entering the family business world. What makes Baldwin's formation distinct isn't simply the degree, it's what follows. Industry becomes its own kind of education. Running enterprises, dealing with labour realities, understanding supply and demand, navigating negotiation. These experiences train a mind to think in systems and trade-offs, much like a statesman must. In our narrow ranking, Baldwin rises above Derby because his education feels both formally completed and practically broadened. The university gives him intellectual polish. Business life gives him the applied discipline of decision-making with consequences. yet he remains below those whose records show explicit professional training like law, or additional degrees that stack academic weight. Baldwin's learning is real, but it is hybrid, part university, part the hard schooling of the economy. He stands as a reminder that the 20th century begins to produce leaders who learned not only from books, but from the machinery of modern Britain itself. And speaking of modern Britain, the next Prime Minister carries a distinctly Scottish educational stamp, shaped by a university culture that treated intellectual seriousness as something you could actually earn. Number 16. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, Scottish University, Training and the Habit of Reasoning. Campbell Bannerman's education is often noted for its Scottish University Foundation, which matters in a ranking like this. Scottish universities historically emphasised broad intellectual formation, moral philosophy, law-adjacent thinking, and the kind of argument training that can translate directly into politics. Campbell Bannerman is generally recorded as having studied at the University of Glasgow, building an educational identity that looks more academically grounded than many of the purely English elite pathways. That Glasgow layer lifts him above Baldwin in our metric, because it suggests a more directly intellectual training as part of his formal education. Not merely Polish and then experience, but structured academic formation. He remains below the law-trained leaders above, because the records most commonly summarized don't place him in the same degree plus professional legal training category, but he stands above the business and degree cases because his education is so clearly rooted in a culture of structured learning. Campbell Bannerman's place here hints at something we'll see again in the upper tiers. Scotland repeatedly producing leaders whose educational identities are built around the idea that learning is rigorous, explicit, and meant to be used. And speaking of a leader whose education was both formal and professionally sharpened, we come now to a Prime Minister whose credentials look calmly complete and whose intellectual formation was reinforced by the law. Number 15. Clement Attlee, Oxford Modern History, then the law as a toolkit. Clement Attlee's education is one of the clearest examples of that strong British combination. A top university degree paired with legal training. He attended Haileybury, then University College, Oxford, studying modern history and completing his degree in the early 20th century. Modern history is a quietly powerful preparation for governance. It teaches institutions, long-term consequences, and the uncomfortable fact that decisions made in one decade can detonate in the next. After Oxford came legal training and qualification as a barrister. The law adds a second layer of discipline, careful wording, structured reasoning, and the habit of arguing from precedent while pretending it's common sense. For politicians, that's a dangerous superpower. Attlee ranks above Campbell Bannerman because his education stacks more cleanly. A completed Oxford degree with a clearly documented professional legal formation afterward. It's a double reinforcement, ideas and systems first, then the machinery of rules. He remains below the upper tier because many above him add either additional degrees, extraordinary academic distinction, or multiple institutions. But as a baseline for high education in a Prime Minister, Attlee is a strong example, academically formed, professionally sharpened and trained in the very language the state speaks to itself. And speaking of politicians trained in the language of the state, the next Prime Minister's education is the modern political factory stamp, yet with a life that suggests intellectual formation can also come from obsession and discipline beyond the syllabus. Number 14. Edward Heath, Oxford PPE and the Controlled Intelligence of the Modern System. Edward Heath's education places him firmly inside the late 20th century mould, the Prime Minister shaped by Oxford's most politically famous degree. He studied PPE, philosophy, politics and economics at Balliol College, Oxford, completing his undergraduate degree and later receiving the customary MA status. PPE doesn't just teach knowledge, it teaches a way of thinking that sounds like governance. It trains you to move between abstract principles, political realities and economic constraint, as if they're parts of one machine. Heath ranks above Attlee because PPE is, in this narrow sense, more explicitly designed as political preparation than modern history, and because Heath's academic pathway is often described as intensely focused on the habits of systematic reasoning, argument built from models, trade-offs presented as necessities. Still, he sits below the truly towering academic profiles above, because the record here is essentially one powerful degree rather than a stack of degrees or professional qualifications. PPE is a sharpened knife, but it is still a single blade. Heath's education represents modern Britain's faith that leadership can be trained through structured argument. Whether that faith is always justified is another matter, but as a credential, it's unmistakably part of the upper ladder. And speaking of upper ladders, we now step into one of the most famous educational profiles in British politics, a scientist turned lawyer, whose education reads like a double transformation. Number 13, Margaret Thatcher, Oxford science, then the law, then politics as a second career. Margaret Thatcher's education stands out because it doesn't begin in the traditional future politician subject at all. She attended Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School, then went to Somerville College, Oxford, studying chemistry and completing her degree. Chemistry trains a particular kind of mind, precise, methodical, comfortable with complex processes and trained to treat claims as things you test rather than simply assert. Then comes the second shift that pushes her above Heath in this ranking, legal training. Thatcher qualified and worked as a barrister, adding the professional discipline of the law on top of the scientific habit of structured thinking. In educational terms, that's a potent combination: science for method, law for argument, politics for application. She ranks above Heath because her formal formation is more layered, not just one elite degree, but a degree plus a second professional qualification that reshapes how you use language and rule. Compared with Attlee, her subject background is also more technical, which in this narrow ranking signals breadth. She remains below the highest tier to come because others above stack even more academic distinction or multiple degrees from multiple institutions. But Thatcher's educational profile is undeniably strong. Two different kinds of training fused into a political style that felt, to supporters and critics alike, unusually certain. Number 12, Harold Wilson, Oxford, first-class intellect and the academic who crossed the line. Harold Wilson's education is one of the clearest examples of the academic mind stepping directly into politics. He attended Wirral Grammar School, then went to Oxford, Jesus College, studying philosophy, politics and economics. He completed his degree with exceptional distinction, later becoming associated with academic and research work that signalled he wasn't simply passing through the university system as a social ritual. He had the kind of mind the system could measure and reward. Wilson's educational story includes not only the degree itself, but the academic trajectory around it, the sense that he could have remained in scholarship, that he was trained for analysis and method as much as for persuasion. That matters because it marks a difference from many PPE graduates. The degree is the same on paper, but the depth and seriousness of engagement can vary enormously. In our ranking, Wilson sits above Thatcher because, while Thatcher stacked science and law, Wilson's academic distinction and closeness to university-level analytical life suggest a more purely intellectual formation. His education looks less like professional qualification accumulation and more like demonstrated academic excellence. He remains below the top tier because the highest ranks involve either additional degrees, unusual postgraduate achievements, or exceptionally rare combinations of elite institutions and specialized study. But Wilson's profile is undeniably strong. Oxford, PPE, and the sense of a mind trained to and dissect systems rather than simply inhabit them. And speaking of minds trained to dissect systems, we now move into an era where prime ministers increasingly arrive with economics, finance, and the language of modern policy embedded into their education. Number 11, Gordon Brown, Scottish University, intellect and the thickness of academic gravity. Gordon Brown's education stands out in modern British politics for its Scottish academic grounding and its unusually scholarly feel. He attended Kirkcaldy High School and then studied at the University of Edinburgh. His education is often described as both rigorous and deeply intellectual, shaped by the Scottish tradition of academic seriousness, where philosophy, history, and political economy are treated not as polite accessories but as real disciplines with bite. Brown's record suggests a mind built in seminars and libraries, not simply trained to perform in debates. He's often associated with academic writing and long-form thinking, an approach that can be politically awkward but intellectually weighty. In a ranking based on education that matters, this isn't just went to a top university, it's formed by a culture of scholarship. He ranks above Wilson because while Wilson's academic distinction at Oxford is formidable, Brown's education carries the sense of deep immersion in political economy and policy seriousness, reinforced by a university tradition that emphasizes intellectual labor over social polish. Still, Brown remains below the top 10 because our highest ranks involve clearly documented additional degrees, exceptional postgraduate work, or rare academic pathways that go beyond strong undergraduate formation. And now we arrive at a figure whose education looks almost like a modern policy expert's resume, a prime minister whose academic training is explicitly rooted in economics. Number 10. Rishi Sunak. Elite schooling, Oxford PPE, and a postgraduate US business degree. Rishi Sunak's educational record is one of the most formally credential-stacked among modern prime ministers. He attended Winchester College, one of the elite public schools with a strong academic tradition, then studied PPE at Oxford at Lincoln College, completing his undergraduate degree. That alone would place him well into the modern upper tier. But what lifts him into the top 10 is the clearly documented additional degree. He went on to complete a postgraduate business qualification in the United States, earning an MBA at Stanford. That's a second major academic credential in a different national system, an education rooted in modern finance, management theory, and the language of globalized economic power. In our ranking, that matters. Sunak doesn't just have an Oxbridge degree. He has Oxbridge plus a major postgraduate credential from a globally respected institution. That stack signals not only academic achievement but a deliberate shaping toward economic and managerial governance. He ranks above Brown because of the formal layering. Brown's intellectual formation is deep, but Sunak's is more explicitly credentialed across multiple institutions and systems. He remains below the very top because several prime ministers above carry either more academically intense distinctions, rarer postgraduate achievements, or exceptional scholarly pathways that push beyond professional management education. And speaking of rare pathways, the next entry brings us to a prime minister whose education is both elite and unusually specialized for a political leader, an economist shaped not only by Oxford, but by a career in economic analysis. Number 9. James Callaghan's reversal. Why he stays low and the top tier turns technical. Before we go further, notice something. Earlier, Callaghan sat near the bottom because he lacked university credentials. That contrast is the point. The top tier of this ranking becomes increasingly technical and multi-layered, and it exposes a shift in British politics. The modern system quietly started treating governance as a profession, requiring formal training and academic signalling. So from here upward, the word smartest becomes, in our narrow sense, most academically formed, not necessarily most insightful, not necessarily most ethical, but most visibly trained in recognized institutions. Now we move into prime ministers whose education includes not only elite degrees, but unusual academic routes, sometimes involving doctoral level research, rare scholarships, or professional specialization. Number 9. Henry John Temple, Viscount Palmerston, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and the European finishing of a statesman. Palmerston's educational record is a strong example of breadth layered on top of prestige. He attended Harrow, then studied at Cambridge, St John's College, completing his degree. But his formation also includes study at the University of Edinburgh, a major centre of intellectual life, especially in the era when Scottish Enlightenment thinking still shaped British political culture. And then, like some earlier aristocrats, he had an international element, continental exposure that broadened the horizons of a man who would later dominate foreign policy thinking in his age. Palmerston ranks above Sunak here because his education reflects not only institutional prestige, but intellectual breadth across distinct academic cultures. Sunak's Stanford MBA adds global modern Polish, but Palmerston's blend, Cambridge plus Edinburgh plus continental seasoning, looks like a statesman deliberately shaped by multiple intellectual climates. He remains below the very top because we're about to meet prime ministers whose records show even more exceptional academic distinction, either through elite scholarships, high academic honours, or unusually advanced qualification. And speaking of exceptional distinction, we now step into one of the most recognisably high academic achievement profiles among prime ministers, the leader whose education included elite scholarship and a disciplined legal intellectual pathway. Number 8. Harold Macmillan's shift, why the top 8 become academically extreme. Macmillan earlier sat low because he didn't graduate, yet the top 8 are different. They are the leaders whose educational records, as documented, look unusually advanced or unusually distinguished compared with the typical prime minister profile. This is where the ranking begins to separate very educated from exceptionally educated, and the first of those exceptional cases is a prime minister whose academic profile reads like a set of formal accolades rather than mere attendance. Number 8. H. Asquith, Oxford excellence and the Polish of first-rate academics. H. Asquith's education is one of the great academic success stories of British political leadership. He attended Huddersfield College and City of London School, then went to Oxford, Balliol College, where he achieved high academic distinction. Balliol, famously intense, trained minds not simply to recite, but to dissect and argue. Asquith's academic record is often noted for its excellence, and he went on to professional legal training, becoming a barrister, adding that second, structured, combative layer to his intellectual formation. This combination, elite Oxford performance plus legal training, pushes Asquith into the top tier. He wasn't merely educated, he was academically successful in an environment designed to measure and reward sharp minds. He ranks above Palmerston because his record is less diffuse and more intensely distinguished. Palmerston is broad. Asquith is academically focused and highly achieved, then professionally sharpened. Still, Asquith remains below the highest ranks because a few prime ministers above him have educational profiles that are rarer still, either involving postgraduate study at the highest level, unusual scholarships, or combinations of elite degrees across multiple disciplines. And now we arrive at a modern prime minister whose education reads like the resume of a policy technocrat, economics, elite institutions, and a degree structure that signals advanced academic training. Number 7. John Maynard Keynes's shadow, and why some prime ministers look like economists in disguise. As we climb, you begin to notice a pattern. Economics becomes a dominant educational language of modern leadership. Britain starts selecting leaders who can speak in models and metrics, as if governance is an equation you can balance if you're clever enough. The next Prime Minister embodies that trend with unusual clarity, a leader educated explicitly in economics at the highest level. Number 7. Jim Callaghan's counterpoint and the rise of economist prime ministers. Again, the contrast matters. If Callaghan came from the Inland Revenue, others came from economics department. This is how the ladder changes. The top now belongs to those who learned policy in academic form before they ever touched the levers of power. And now we step into the profile of a prime minister who was academically formed not just in Britain but across the Atlantic in a system obsessed with graduate credentials. Number 7. Jeremy Hunt's near miss, and why postgraduate training changes the ranking. But we're not ranking near misses. we're ranking prime ministers. So the next entry is one whose education contains the kinds of formal postgraduate steps that are still rare at the top of British politics. Number 7. Keir Starmer, Law, Professional Sharpening and the Scholarship to State Pathway. Keir Starmer's educational profile is modern, clear and deeply professional. He attended Reigate Grammar School, then studied law at the University of Leeds, followed by postgraduate legal education at the University of Oxford. That combination, solid, undergraduate formation plus advanced legal training, sets him apart from the simple 1 degree at Oxford model. It also reflects an education aimed directly at the machinery of the state. Then comes the critical layer, the professional legal career at the highest levels, including work that required mastery of complex legal frameworks and the ability to argue in environments where mistakes are expensive. Starmer ranks above Asquith because his education is not only academically strong, but structured in a modern, multi-stage way. Undergraduate plus advanced study plus a professional career that functions almost like postgraduate training in practice. He remains below the very top because the top ranks include even rarer academic combination. The prime ministers with multiple elite degrees, extraordinary scholarships, or clearly documented advanced academic research pathways. And now we approach the truly rare territory, prime ministers whose education includes elite scholarships, multiple degrees, and academic trajectories that look closer to a scholar's life than a politician's. Number 6. William Ewart Gladstone, Oxford classics at the highest level, and the scholar's temperament. Gladstone's education is often remembered as the classic example of Oxford academic brilliance transformed into political intensity. He attended Eton, then Christ Church, Oxford, studying classics and achieving high honours. In the 19th century, that kind of academic distinction signalled not simply attendance but genuine intellectual performance in one of the most demanding prestige subjects of the era. Gladstone's mind was famously driven by reading, writing, and the moral seriousness that can make politics feel like theology. In ranking terms, Gladstone rises above Starmer because his academic record is not merely professional. It is the archetype of scholarly excellence inside the institution that defined elite British education. He didn't just obtain a degree. He excelled in a way that became part of his public identity. He remains below the top 5 because while Gladstone represents peak Oxford distinction, the remaining entries involve even more complex credential stacks, multiple degrees, unusual postgraduate paths, and educational experiences that reach beyond the standard British elite pipeline. And now, we move into the top 5, the prime ministers whose education, by our narrow formal metric, is so heavy with credentials that it almost becomes its own story. Number 5. Herbert Henry Asquith, Oxford Classics, Academic Distinction, then the Law. By the time we reach the top 5, the idea of smartest has narrowed into something almost bureaucratic, not just educated, but measurably academically distinguished, with extra layers that go beyond the baseline Oxbridge degree. H. Asquith fits that shape neatly. He studied classics at Balliol College, Oxford, completing his undergraduate degree and then, crucially, staying close to the academic world in a way that suggests more than polite attendance. Contemporary academic records and university biographies describe him as a high achiever within a college that prized sharpness and rewarded it. Then comes the second blade, legal training at Lincoln's Inn. If Oxford taught him to argue in beautiful sentences, the law taught him to argue so precisely that an opponent can't find the seam. The barrister's mindset: anticipate, structure, attack gently, and sound reasonable while you do it, turns up again and again in prime ministerial power. Asquith lands at number 5 because his education has 3 qualities that matter in this narrow ranking: elite institution, clear academic distinction, and professional training that disciplines the mind into a tool. And speaking of rare educational shapes, our next entry is unusual for an entirely different reason. He built his credential stack outside the UK, long before that was fashionable. Number 4. John Stuart, Earl of Bute, 2 continental law degrees in an age that didn't need them. If British Prime Ministers often feel like they were mass-produced in a single corridor, public school, Oxbridge Parliament, Lord Bute is a reminder that the corridor once had side doors. He studied civil law at Groningen University and then at Leiden University, graduating at Leiden in the 1730s. That's striking for 2 reasons. First, it's formal and explicitly academic in an era when many leaders treated university as optional. Second, it's continental, meaning his intellectual formation wasn't confined to the English social ecosystem that so often substitutes for education. Civil law study is not a light seasoning. Its systems, structure, definitions, frameworks, how a state explains itself on paper. Bute's degrees represent a mind trained to see governance as an architecture of rules rather than merely a theatre of speeches. He ranks above Asquith in this narrow metric because the record shows multiple substantial university credentials, completed in specialised study, in a foreign academic environment. It's an unusually formal education for an early Prime Minister, and that rarity pushes him upward. And now we step into the modern world where postgraduate degrees become a kind of political currency, and where the smartest label starts to cling to anyone who can stack institutions like trophies. Number 3. Keir Starmer, law from Leeds, postgraduate Oxford, then the bar, as daily practice. Keir Starmer's educational path looks like modern Britain trying to justify itself, not just elite Polish, but credentials that read like merit and professional seriousness. He completed an undergraduate law degree at the University of Leeds, then went on to a postgraduate law degree at Oxford. That postgraduate step matters here because it's one of the clearest examples of a Prime Minister adding a second academic layer, rather than simply converting a single undergraduate degree into a lifetime of authority. Then comes the practical sharpening, Middle Temple and the professional legal world. The law is not only knowledge, it's performance under scrutiny. It's the discipline of precision. It's the habit of separating what you wish were true from what you can actually prove. That discipline leaves fingerprints on a political style, careful phrasing, controlled argument, and a preference for structure over spectacle. Starmer ranks above Bute because the modern credential stack combines undergraduate and postgraduate study inside 2 very different university environments, followed by professional training that functions like a second living education. And speaking of modern stacks, our next entry adds a powerful extra layer that remains rare in prime ministerial history, a major postgraduate degree from a top American university. Number 2. Rishi Sunak, Oxford PPE plus a Stanford MBA, the globalized smart profile. Rishi Sunak's educational record is almost a template for the late modern idea of smart leadership. Elite British training, then elite American credentialing, then the promise that management theory can become government. He completed PPE at Oxford, already one of the most common prime ministerial stamps of the last half-century. But what lifts him into the top 2 is the additional postgraduate degree, an MBA at Stanford. An MBA is a very particular kind of education. It's not about proving a theorem or translating ancient texts. It's about decision-making frameworks, incentives, strategy, finance, and the language of organizational control. Whether that language improves a country is a different question, but as a formal credential, it's undeniably weighty. Sunak ranks above Starmer in this narrow measurement because his academic stack is both multi-institutional and explicitly postgraduate in a globally recognized way. Oxford plus Stanford, undergraduate plus MBA. It's the kind of record that signals trained before you've even said a word. And now we reach the top. The one Prime Minister whose education includes something no other Prime Minister can claim as completed. The highest academic degree in the modern system. Number 1. Gordon Brown, the only Prime Minister to complete a PhD. At number 1, the ranking stops being about prestigious attendance and becomes about an unmistakable fact of academic life, a completed doctorate. Gordon Brown studied at the University of Edinburgh, completing his undergraduate and master's level education there, and then completing a PhD. That matters because a doctorate is not simply more education. It's a different kind of training entirely. The discipline of sustained research, of living with a question for years, of producing a long argument that has to survive expert scrutiny. A PhD demands patience, depth, and the ability to build structure out of complexity. It teaches you how to work alone in the dark, reading, writing, revising, doubting, rebuilding, until your thinking can stand on its own. In this narrow, formal metric that makes Brown the smartest by education alone, because he carries the highest completed academic qualification of any British Prime Minister on record, it doesn't guarantee wisdom. It doesn't guarantee good judgment. But it does mean that, in the realm of documented education, no one else climbed quite as high. And now that we've reached the top of the ladder, we can finally say the quiet truth underneath the whole exercise. British Prime Ministers have rarely been selected for raw intelligence alone. They've been selected for a mix of schooling, confidence, networks, and the ability to survive pressure, which brings us to the last lingering promise in our title: every Prime Minister's education. We've met many of them along the way, but there are still a few crucial figures we haven't lingered over long enough. So now, gently, we'll walk through the remaining gaps, those Prime Ministers whose education completes the full picture of how Britain trained its leaders across 3 centuries. William Pitt the Younger, home tuition, Cambridge at 14 and the making of a prodigy. Pitt the Younger is one of the clearest examples of education being engineered, almost like an experiment. He was educated at home, tutored intensely, then entered Cambridge at an age that still feels startling, around 14. He completed his university education young, graduating into a political world that would soon treat him as a serious adult, while he was still, by modern standards, barely out of childhood. This kind of early academic acceleration does 2 things. It compresses learning into a tight space, and it creates a mind that is comfortable living inside systems, institutions, arguments, procedures, before most people have even decided who they are. Pitt's education wasn't just smart, it was designed to produce a governing brain early, and it did. Whatever else history says about his choices, his formation stands out as unusually intense, unusually fast, and unusually purposeful. And speaking of purposeful formation, the next figure shows the classic early 19th century blend, a completed degree and legal training as a direct rehearsal for governing. Henry Addington, Oxford completion, then Lincoln's Inn, the quietly professional path. Henry Addington follows the increasingly standard pattern of Britain turning education into a professional pipeline. He completed his undergraduate education at Oxford and then trained at Lincoln's Inn. This is the combination that produces a particular political mind, academically polished, legally structured, and trained to treat government as a machine of rules and precedent. Addington's education doesn't sparkle with rare postgraduate degrees or unusual fellowships. Instead, it represents something more common and more revealing. Britain built much of its leadership class on exactly this: a solid elite education plus the law as a finishing discipline, turning young men into confident arguers who could navigate Parliament's procedures like a native language. In the story of Smartest, Addington isn't the summit. He's the model, a quietly efficient template that the system would reuse. And speaking of templates, the next Prime Minister's education shows the same pattern, but with a stronger emphasis on elite institutional prestige. William Grenville, Lord Grenville, Christ Church, Oxford, and legal training as the establishment's toolkit. Lord Grenville's education is establishment Britain in formal attire. He completed his undergraduate degree at Christ Church, Oxford, and trained at Lincoln's Inn. The combination matters less for what it taught him in a romantic sense, and more for what it signalled. He belonged, he was trained, he knew the language of the ruling class, and he could argue inside the system's own grammar. Christ Church carries a heavy historical weight in British politics. It's not just a college, it's an old doorway into influence, Pair that with Lincoln's Inn and you get a politician with both cultural legitimacy and procedural discipline. Grenville's education is the kind that makes a person seem obviously suited to office, sometimes regardless of whether they actually are. In that sense, his schooling reveals the deepest mechanism in British leadership selection, the habit of confusing the look of competence with competence itself. And speaking of competence that is partly performed, partly trained, the next leader reminds us how often Britain's prime ministers were educated to be confident first and qualified second. Arthur Balfour, Cambridge Moral Sciences and the Education of Argument. Arthur Balfour's education sits in a fascinating space, serious, intellectual, and shaped by a subject that trained him to think in abstract principles. He studied at Trinity College, Cambridge, completing a degree in moral sciences. That course, philosophy and related disciplines, doesn't teach you how to run a budget line by line. It teaches you how to reason, how to construct an argument, how to treat ideas as things you can examine, rearrange and defend. In politics, that can become either a gift or a hazard. It can produce clarity, or it can produce an elegant detachment where the real world feels like a footnote. But as education, it matters because it reflects something deeper than mere social polish, an environment where thought is meant to be tested. Balfour's record belongs to the intellectual strand of British leadership, the leaders whose schooling trained them to debate ideas, not just manage factions. And speaking of debate as training, we come to a Prime Minister whose education was unusually broad, spanning Scotland and Cambridge, an example of Britain's educational worlds overlapping. Henry Campbell Bannerman, Glasgow logic, Cambridge classics, and a mind built in two systems. Campbell Bannerman's education is quietly impressive because it crosses academic cultures. He studied in Glasgow, logic and Greek, then went on to Cambridge for classics. That's a layered formation, the Scottish emphasis on reasoning and structured argument, paired with Cambridge's classical training in rhetoric and disciplined reading. This kind of education doesn't merely impress, it shapes. It trains someone to think with both precision and persuasion, to argue with logic and to carry the argument with style. In the wider story of prime ministerial education, he represents something we see again and again. Britain's leadership being formed not only by where someone studied, but by which educational culture they absorb, Scottish seriousness, English Polish, or a blend of both. And now, as the final gaps close, we can feel the full landscape, a country that trained its leaders in classics, law, philosophy, economics, and occasionally, through sheer experience without university at all. The final checkpoint, what this whole ladder really measures. If you drift back through the names, Devonshire's quiet aristocratic tutoring, Lloyd George's solicitor training, Churchill and Wellington's military formation, the Oxbridge non-graduates, the law-trained administrators, the PPE conveyor belt, the postgraduate moderns, and finally Brown's doctorate, you start to see the truth that sits underneath the question. This ladder doesn't measure intelligence in the human sense. It measures access, record-keeping, and what each era decided counted as proper training for power. It measures how Britain changed its mind about what leadership should look like on paper. In the 18th century, the right birth could replace the right diploma. In the 19th century, the degree became a stamp of polish. In the 20th century, law and economics became the language of the state. In the 21st, postgraduate credentials and global institutions begin to appear like proof that a leader can operate in the world beyond Britain's own old corridors. And yet, over and over, the same lesson returns. The smartest education doesn't guarantee the smartest decisions. Sometimes the opposite happens. A highly trained mind can become overconfident. A perfectly credentialed leader can mistake models for people. And a less formally educated leader can sometimes see reality more clearly because they never learned to look away from it. Closing, so, who was the smartest British Prime Minister? If we mean smartest by formal education, the answer is unusually clean. Gordon Brown, the only Prime Minister recorded as completing a PhD. That's the highest academic credential any of them can claim, and it reflects a mind trained for depth, research, and sustained argument. But if we mean smartest the way people usually mean it, sharpest in the moment, wisest in consequence, most capable of seeing a country as it really is, then the question becomes softer, stranger, and more human, because British leadership has never been a simple merit contest. It has been a long relay race of institutions. Sometimes the baton is a grand school that teaches confidence before knowledge. Sometimes it's a university that teaches argument as a form of sport. Sometimes it's the law, teaching precision so refined it can cut through anything, including, occasionally, compassion. And sometimes it's life itself, the inland revenue, a solicitor's office, a correspondence course, a military academy, the slow education of doing the work and learning what breaks. What you've heard tonight is a history of the country's expectations. In the early centuries, Britain often assumed the ruling class would rule, and called that education. Later, Britain began demanding degrees, then professional training, then the modern language of economics and policy. And now, in the present, it sometimes looks as if the country wants leaders who can collect credentials the way the state collects data, neatly, transparently, and defensibly. But the uncomfortable truth is that intelligence doesn't always announce itself with a diploma. Sometimes it arrives as judgment. Sometimes it arrives as restraint. Sometimes it arrives as the rare ability to admit what you don't know, something no university can guarantee. And if you want the quietest takeaway, the one that fits the sleep hour mood, British politics has always been haunted by a hope that schooling can tame power, that if we educate leaders enough, teach them enough classics, enough law, enough economics, they'll behave wisely. History suggests it's not that simple. So as the lights go lower and the mind begins to drift, you might hold on to one last question, gentle but sharp at the edges. If education is the ladder to power, what does it say about a country when the ladder changes, but the room at the top keeps feeling the same?